and I use that word sarcastically, the New Deal's supposed effect wasn't fully realized until the United States entered World War II. Now, I don't mean to argue that our current situation is directly comparable to the Great Depression. I would say it is far from it. But I do hope that the Democrats' long-term plan isn't to keep expanding the federal government for several years, wait for an unforeseen outside calamity to take place, and rescue the economy, and then take credit for the recovery. To be sure, Roosevelt's New Deal was not without some success, but it largely failed to restore prosperity to the American economy because instead of implementing policies aimed at fostering economic growth and expansion, it was designed as a top-down restructuring of the economy, making the government the major decision-maker in economic matters. The results were labor policies designed to preset wages at levels preferred by unions, regardless of market conditions, trade and manufacturing policies designed to set production at levels other than those set by supply and demand, and taxes on businesses that stifled growth and prevented them from hiring new employees. Sadly, the President and the majority leadership in Congress have apparently decided that despite these shortcomings, the New Deal should be repeated. We've seen it in the President's efforts to seize control of auto companies, only to hand it over to his labor union supporters. We see it in proposals here in Congress to use the bankruptcy code to basically preset interest rates for lenders. And at a time when credit is already harder to come by, that's what they're doing. And we're seeing it in the proposals to raise taxes on small businesses despite harsh economic times and rising unemployment. President Obama may be the richest man in America these days, but he is doing so on the back of the American taxpayers. If history is any indication, his efforts will not leave anyone else in America any richer or better off. It is not hard to find examples of the government growing at an exceptionally fast pace. Just by looking at the number of government employees as a percentage of America's population, one can easily see how we have increased the size of government. In 1815, the U.S. numbered 8.3 million people, 4,837 of which were government employees. In other words, only about 1/20th of 1% of Americans work for the government. In 2007, our nation numbered 281 million Americans, 2.7 million of them government employees. That is nearly 1%, or about 20 times the numbers of government employees in 1815. 1% of the population, or about 20 times the number of government employees in 1815. That percentage will certainly increase given this president's budget, which contains 121 new government programs. Another indication of the growth of government power can be illustrated through the amount of government spending. Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development figures show that government spending in the United States is on the rise, comparable with that of many European countries. In fact, government spending has decreased in most European nations while it has increased in the United States. In France, for instance, the government spending is close to 50% of GDP, while England's government spending is roughly 44% of GDP. Now, this is all spending, government spending. Germany's is 45% of GDP. In the U.S., federal government spending has been around 20% historically. However, to accurately compare the U.S. to European nations, it is necessary to include state and local spending. Once that is factored in, and much of that is driven by the federal government and the programs that we're coming up with here, but once that's factored in, U.S. government spending exceeds, right now, 37%, the second bar graph above, 37% of GDP, and that is before President Obama's stimulus package and budget for this year are taken into account. Thus, it is almost a foregone conclusion that by the end of this year, total government spending in the United States will approach that of many European governments. We've jumped way ahead from the 2008 figure to the current figure on that chart, just barely behind the European countries. Now, if you take a look at President Obama's past 5 months in office, you will see the largest proposed 10-year spending increase in our nation's history. We have a stimulus bill worth $787 billion, or close to $1.3 trillion if interest is taken into account. We have nearly exhausted the $700 billion troubled asset relief program, and we have a budget proposal estimated to create a $9 trillion deficit over the next 10 years. According to the Congressional Budget Office, that's what's going to happen. To put that another way, federal spending would be nearly 24% of our nation's GDP. Government spending alone in 2009 will reach 27%. Now, that's federal government spending alone. In 2009 will reach 27%. Now, when you add in state and local spending, that would put us nearly on par in total government spending with Germany. As you can see, we're almost right there. The American people, especially Utahns, are speaking out against this increase in the size of government. They are organizing Tax Enough Already, or T rallies around the country, and they're fed up with the government bailout after bailout. They correctly wonder when or if this government expansion will ever stop. That's why I have introduced two pieces of legislation to reduce government spending. One is Limitation on Government Spending Act, the LOGS Act, limit government spending to 20% of GDP. The second one is Stop the TARP Asset Recycling Act, the STAR Act, and that's to prevent perpetual bailout and to repay our national debt with returned TARP funds. Don't just take them and spend more. Give them back to the taxpayers. Give them back to the government so that we can pay down some of these deficits and some of these problems that are going on. They're two very important bills. Let me just discuss them again. The Limitation on Government Spending Act would limit government spending to the national historic average of 20% of GDP. And while I believe government spending should be much lower than that, the least we can do is ensure that government spending does not get out of control like the way it is currently headed. Furthermore, the Stop TARP Asset Recycling Act would require all funds paid out of the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP, and that amounted to $700 billion, all those funds that are returned or paid back, they must be placed in the general fund to pay down the nation's debt instead of being recycled back into TARP or more spending. Otherwise, TARP could become a revolving slush fund for the Treasury Department to bail out or seize companies. Now, it's a time that we put an end to that. The Obama administration's honeymoon is over. More Americans than ever agree that we need to rein in this administration's runaway government spending. And I might add, we better get prepared for massive taxation, too. Their belief is to spend and tax and build the federal government at all costs. More Americans than ever agree that we need to rein in this administration's runaway government spending. According to a Washington Post ABC news poll, barely half of Americans are now confident that President Obama's $787 billion stimulus measure will boost the economy. Think about it, barely half of all Americans. Furthermore, a USA Today poll reveals that a 51% majority disapproved of the job he has done in controlling federal spending. Even President Obama agrees with this. After the massive amounts of government spending he has signed into law, President Obama had the audacity to proclaim in an April 18th weekly address that we need to restore responsibility and accountability to our federal budget. Who are we kidding? The president cannot put us on a course to a $9 trillion deficit and then tell us that we need to be more fiscally responsible. That is akin to someone killing their parents and then complaining about being an orphan. In the same address, the president continued this hypocrisy by saying, quote, "We are on an unsustainable course, and we need to restore the people's confidence in government by spending their money wisely," unquote. But wait, it gets even better. After signing into law a $787 billion stimulus and a $3 trillion deficit, he nobly stated, quote, if we want to spend, we need to find somewhere else to cut, unquote. Now, if you doubt the hypocrisy, you do not have to look further than the current health care debate or the cap-and-trade program he proposes to pay for by levying even more taxes. The closest the president has come to cut spending was by calling upon his department heads to find $100 million in savings. $100 million. I guess you would call that, quote, pocket change, unquote, that we can believe in. Mr. President, enough is enough. No more spending, no more taxes, no more government expansion. We are not looking for a New Deal. We are looking for smaller, more efficient government. We are not looking for another government bailout. Whatever happened to ask not what your country can do for you, ask it what you can do for your country. Where Obamanopoly is concerned, it's time to say game over. It's time to pull the reins on this headlong rush toward the Europeanization of America. And as former President Gerald Ford said, a government that is big enough to give you all you want is big enough to take it all away.